Hello, lovelies. I hope you're all okay. I'm back on the radar after more than a month away, and I just wanted to explain that a little. I'm still literally climbing out of the worst and most horrible chest infection I've had in my life, and I've been sick since New Year. Just coming out of it now, and we're in the middle of February. So I know that January passed in a blur for a lot of people. For me, it passed in a blur of the worst sickness I've had in my entire life. And there was a point at which, when I was sitting in the hospital, that I genuinely thought I wasn't going to come back. I thought, this is it for me. I can't remember ever having felt so sick. And someone said to me that this particular illness that I had was around about an 8 to 10 week recovery. And I thought, no, I can't wait until the middle of March, which is what that would have put me into, to get going, because the year is already underway and I've got loads to do. I've got lots to offer to you all. So I wanted to just crack on with it, really. And in the last week or so, I've kind of got my voice back. So I sound a little less like a chainsaw, but I do want to just apologize in case the voice gets a little bit scratchy in the process of this podcast. But it's one that's really important to me, that I wanted to get out to you before too much more time goes by. And another preemptive apology: I'm working from home as ever, and of course, you can't always control the background noise, especially when it's a couple of dogs who somehow can't find the ability to be quiet today. So if you hear a little bit of dog wrestling or some woof woofs in the background, it's just my two wanting to be a part of this podcast and make their voices heard as well. Okay, so let's crack on. And I want to talk today about the fear that a lot of women have around publishing their work. And a lot of women say to me that they don't think what they have to say or write about is worthy of publication. And I totally get that, because it's not that long since I was there myself and wrestling with the absolutely terrifying prospect of publishing a piece of work. It's only 2.5 years since I published my first novel, No Small Change. And when people hear that someone's published their first book, they often imagine excitement, champagne corks popping, a feeling of achievement and celebration, and a sense of arrival too, that feeling of finally having some credibility as a published author. And yeah, for me, there was excitement and a feeling of celebration. But what most people don't realize is how daunting it can feel to be putting your work into the public domain for the very first time. So today I want to talk openly and honestly about what it was like for me to publish my first novel, not from a place of triumph, but from a place of real vulnerability, I suppose, because yeah, that's where I was in the process at the time. And I know that I'm not the only one who's felt this way, and I don't want it to be the thing that stops women from using their amazing voices in ways that really matter. For a long time, my novel, No Small Change, just lived quietly within me, within my heart. I carried it and let it evolve quietly and privately while it formed in its own way and time. While I was writing it, the story belonged exclusively to me. I could change whatever elements I wanted. I could protect it and myself from judgment. But there came a moment in that process when I realized that if I published it, it would no longer be mine in the same way. Other people would read it and form opinions about it. They'd interpret it through their own experiences, and they'd talk about it, maybe in ways I didn't want. And that's when I got scared, and I started to ask myself, what am I really putting into the world here? Do I really want to do this? What surprised me the most when I sat and thought about it was discovering that my fear wasn't really about the writing. It wasn't about grammar or structure, whether the plot worked or whether the characters were likable. No, it was about exposure. Because even when a story is fiction, even when it's imagined, parts of the writer inevitably come through it. Even unwittingly, it shows something about the way we see the world, what our emotional concerns and preoccupations are, Maybe it even exposes our fears to some extent. Publishing felt like openly declaring, this is how my mind works. This is what I care about. This is the kind of story I think matters. And that felt a bit scary, like some of my thoughts wouldn't just be my own anymore. They'd be open to interpretation, maybe in ways I didn't intend or want. Because I think one of the hardest things about publishing a first novel is that it asks you to be seen properly. Not as a hobbyist, not as someone having a dabble, but as someone who's chosen to stand behind their words. And that's a different kind of courage. It's not overt, it's not in-your-face bravery, it's not performative, it's the quiet courage of saying, I'm willing to let this exist without explaining or defending it. And that's no easy thing, especially for women. Many women of my generation have been taught to stand back, to stay quiet, to soften ourselves and minimize our achievements, to qualify what we do by saying something like, oh, that it's just a little thing, before anyone else can judge it, to get in first and minimize it before someone else does. And publishing removes that wall of protection. The work is out there for public consumption, and once it's out there, it can't be called back. It is what it is, warts and all. Of course, I did worry a bit about the criticism. Who wouldn't? But mercifully, I had got to that point in my life where it didn't matter as much to me as it would have when I was younger, what others thought. Yeah, you still want people to like your work, but the thing about writing and putting it into the public domain is that you have to be doing it for yourself before you do it for anyone else. The reasons for going ahead have to outweigh the reasons for stalling. And that involves being honest about why you want to do it. What surprised me was the fear of misjudgment. The fear that people would misunderstand the story, miss the message I was offering, or maybe even read things into it that weren't there, or even overlook the things that mattered the most to me. Because once a book is published, you don't get to go and stand next to every reader and say, what I meant was. No, the book has to speak for itself, and that requires trust, not just in the work, but in yourself. For me, publishing my book also led to a grief, a real sense of loss that I hadn't expected to feel. Because finishing and publishing a first novel signals the end of a very private relationship. For me, it was one that had evolved over time, where I'd created these amazing characters and learned so much about them as they unfolded and evolved. I felt like they were my friends by the time the novel was finished. They felt real to me, and in some way, publishing the book so that others could meet them too almost felt as if I were throwing them to the wolves. And what most people don't discover until after publication is that once the story is out there in the public domain, it no longer needs its author in the same way. I was redundant at that point as far as that book was concerned. My novel had stopped being a place where I could hide or keep control, and it became something that moved independently of me. My work was done. It was the end of something. And I remember feeling slightly untethered, I suppose, when it had been signed off and was about to be launched. I walked around the house in a bit of a daze for probably a week while I tried to figure out what to do with my time. Because the work had been all-consuming. To finish the book, then edit it, get it formatted and prepared for publication, get the cover designed, get it all launched on the different literary platforms. That had been a long and intense process. And suddenly it was over. I'd gone from running at 100 miles an hour to suddenly standing still. And shortly after that, the reality sank in that no small change was the end of something, but it was also the beginning of something else. It dawned on me that it was begging to be turned into a series because my wonderful, slightly batty, wildly menopausal protagonist, Adie Raven, still had a lot to say and do and be in her life, and I didn't want to let go of her. She didn't seem to want me to. She kept returning to my mind, and I realised that she was trying to tell me that I needed to keep going. So I started on book number 2 in what has become the Teapot Cottage series. The power of notes and spells is someone else's story, but Adie is still very much a part of it, as she goes on to be in all of the other novels that came after that. Before I knew what had happened, we were 8 novels in, and she was still going strong in my heart and in my mind and in the lives of every person the series talks about where she has had an impact. Of course, I was really proud of my achievement in completing and publishing No Small Change. I was relieved too that I'd managed to get it published. But there was a sense of loss, and I was really surprised to feel that. Nobody prepared me for that. It felt so daunting to publish that book. But I came to understand something really important. The anxiety and, a little bit of fear, I suppose, around publishing. That wasn't a sign that I shouldn't do it. I realised that I was anxious because the novel really mattered to me. If it had meant nothing, letting it go would have been easy. I could have just stuffed it in a drawer, shut the drawer, and never thought about it again. But it did matter. And it meant that there was something at stake. I had skin in the game. Publishing No Small Change wasn't about confidence either, because I still didn't have much of that at the time. For me, it was about making the commitment to myself that I stood by my story, even as the fact that it wasn't just mine anymore was making me feel a wee bit anxious and uncomfortable. One of the biggest myths we're sold is that confidence should come first, that we should wait until we feel ready or assured or certain before we step forward and put our work into the public arena. But that is not how creative courage works. It's not how we're meant to fly as authors. I was unsure and I felt exposed, but I also felt hopeful. I was scared, but I had got to the point where I'd managed to convince myself that there wasn't much to lose really, because the people who read my work don't know me, most of them at least, and therefore, whatever judgment they might make, it's superficial rather than coming from a place of knowing or appreciating my worth. So I went ahead and published the book. The courage didn't remove the fear. It sat alongside it, coexisting and jostling for space, for balance, I suppose. And eventually the balance came. And I decided that I wanted to leave something in the world for after I'd gone. I wanted women to still read my books when they got to a certain age, so that even if I was long gone, they could still be inspired by my words that were always aimed at showing them something important about life, about themselves, and about the fact that no matter how hard things get, there's always a way forward. And that's what I've always been about. So in a sense, putting my book out there was showing my heart to the people I wanted to see it. And the third novel I published was actually the very first one I ever wrote, and it's the one I'm the most proud of. A Moral Swerve is not part of the Teapot Cottage series. In fact, it is written in a different and much darker genre, but it was the first book I wrote, and back in the day, I couldn't get an agent to pick it up. It's the story of a woman who comes home from work unexpectedly early one day and finds intruders in her house. What she goes on to do has long-term, deep repercussions for a lot of people. And one of the two main protagonists that drive that story is a criminal who has done quite a lot of jail time for various acquisitive crimes. He calls a spade, and he's rough and ready, and he doesn't hold back with his language. I based him on a combination of prisoners I worked with when I was working as a psychologist in the prison service, and I wanted to write him as authentically as I could. I couldn't find an agent with the stomach to take that book on, so I ended up shelving it for a few years until I managed to find a way to tie it in to the Teapot Cottage series. Publishing that book, A Moral Swerve, was even more daunting than publishing No Small Change because the genre was different, and it put me on the outside of being pigeonholed as writing simply in a cozy genre, and that felt like a huge risk. But I did it, and as I say, it still is and probably always will be the novel I'm the most proud of having written. If I go on and write another 10, another 20 novels, A Moral Swerve will still be the work I feel the most connected to as the first book I ever wrote. I poured so much heart into it, and I'm pleased to say that it has been well received. And it's probably true for every writer who writes and publishes more than one book. There's probably a favourite that will always stand. A Moral Swerve represents a level of bravery for me that goes far beyond what I experienced in publishing No Small Change. If I could go back to my earlier self, or to anyone on the edge of publishing their first piece of work, I'd say that it's okay to be scared. It's okay to hesitate, and it's okay to care very much about your work and how it might be received. And none of that disqualifies you. Publishing is not an attempt at perfection, because there's no such thing, and everybody knows that. And people who are looking for that in any shape or form, including the written word, will be forever disappointed. I recently had someone criticize me by saying that my book was riddled with spelling mistakes, unquote. And I had to laugh at that, because what it really meant was that she'd failed to pick up on the dialectical quirks and bangs that thread through my work, like accents and spoonerisms and the like. I explained them within the narrative so people understand what it's all about, but she didn't get it. And that's okay. Sometimes people just don't, and that's life. The decision to write a book and publish it is a decision to declare yourself, to use your voice and know that it matters, because it does. And one thing I told myself over and over at the beginning of the publishing process, while my knees were knocking and I felt so vulnerable, just as I don't like everything I read, some people are not going to like what I write. And that's not personal. So it was a waste of time clinging to the fear that it was. It's just life, and as long as you keep it in perspective and understand that some people will not be fans of the genre you write in, others will love it. You can't be all things to all people, so focusing on the ones who do like your work takes away the pressure of fretting about the ones who don't. I take all the feedback I get with a hefty pinch of salt. I don't get a lot of negative feedback, to be fair, but when I do, I let it go as a simple fact of life that my genres don't appeal to everyone. And someone who sings my praises is lovely, of course, but that's just their opinion too. One man's meat is another man's poison, and vice versa. I try to keep a good perspective wherever possible about the feedback I get from people over something that's always highly subjective. So for anyone listening who's hesitating about putting pen to paper or type to screen, if you're listening to this and you're sitting on a piece of work, a story, a book, a project, an idea, and you're dithering over it, I want to offer you this. You don't need to feel bold or brave to move forward. You don't need to feel certain. You don't need to feel ready in the way you might imagine readiness should feel. All you have to do is make a start and let things go from there. Publishing my first novel, No Small Change, was probably one of the most daunting things I've ever done in my life. Publishing A Moral Swerve was even more so, but it's taught me something I always keep in my mind, and I'll share it with you because it matters for you just like it does for me. When I started out, my voice didn't need to be confident, to be valid. It just needed to be used. It needed to be mine, and it needed to be real. Because having something wonderful to offer is a waste of time if you're not going to go ahead and do it. Choosing to be seen and heard is one of the most honest and creative acts there is. And as a gift to the world, I think it would be hard to find one better. Thank you for listening. Okay, I will talk to you soon.